Yeah.
So I guess to set the stage for that, I'd like to go back to something that, in 2016 that will maybe set a foundation for how cyber works, so people can understand, what you did at CrowdStrike, how important it is, and how influential it can be in the world, politically and otherwise. So in the 2016 election, everyone knows there was this big Democratic National Convention hack, the DNC hack, where they hacked, I believe it was Hillary's campaign manager or just the general convention's email.
Yep.
And they were sharing these emails, and there were things being shown that, there was a quote unquote conspiracy or people conspiring to, what was it, versus Bernie Sanders, I believe it was. And then there was all of these things spilled out into the public that it could be argued was helpful to help Trump gain even more ground in that election. So when CrowdStrike is the identifier, which I don't think many people know, that they're the one that attributed Russia to hacking the DNC email, you hear a lot of the conspiracy theorists and MAGA folks, being like, "Oh, Russia, Russia, Russia! This is all a hoax. This is this, that, and the other." So I was hoping maybe you can take us through, like, how would your unit or a unit at CrowdStrike identify that this hack is indeed done, perpetrated by Russia specifically, and not, another state-backed entity, or perhaps even a state masquerading as another state? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess I'll kind of start at the beginning in the fact that, like, what you're seeing nowadays, what we're living through in the past decade, basically, is the transformation of cyber from just being like an espionage tool to being almost like a state, a statecraft, and also like hybrid warfare type of tool, where cyber before was always thought of as like a logistical support thing, like just kind of, you hack the enemy to kind of figure out like where their supply lines are and things like that, and then there's some physical guys on the ground that go and and try and disrupt that or something like that. But now you're seeing, even in Ukraine, what's currently going on is obviously like cyber attacks were being used immediately to take down power grids so that people could sneak in the dead of night. And so it's no longer as supportive, and it's much more directed to outcomes, like how can I get exactly what I want? And so the DNC one, it was, a really good example of Russia basically has, playbooks that they run for kind of like hybrid warfare that basically like, we've been nuclear powers for a very long time, and we've come very, very close to nuclear war many different times. People, I think, still don't realize that it was like literally one level-headed person not pushing a button at a certain time that like has not blown the entire world up at this point.
Crazy.
But
sobering.
We've kind of evolved from that to now be in this hybrid warfare space where it's like, okay, you're not in full out war, but you're basically in a mini constant state of war when it comes to cyber. So like the issue is that like we're basically already at war in cyber pretty much most of the time. And so that's going on with China and Russia, and it's just these like little gains and little footholds every other place. But the DNC was a particularly interesting one because that was basically, Russia has a playbook that's about how to run political interference, or get a candidate that they prefer in the lead, or kind of like to get them into a better position because they know that they'll be treated favorably. And so there's plenty of evidence to suggest that what Trump had looked into building a Trump hotel in Moscow. There's a whole bunch of this stuff that's all open source. It's all out there.
Right. There's a lot.
And that talks about his
evidence.
Yeah, that talks about his interest in Russia and how he views Vladimir Putin and how he views other strongman leaders like Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, that he has this like admiration for them about how they're able to like control their countries. And so, the QAnon stuff aside, is basically just like, there's just plenty of evidence that he had, things that were going on in Russia that would be beneficial to his business that he wasn't necessarily going to put aside. And that Russia knew very early on, from a US and a Western intelligence perspective, that Trump was their preferred candidate because they would be treated much more favorably if he won. So, these operations don't happen just overnight. Like, you have to set up a lot of, it's a lot of prep work to do, buy the domains ahead of time, spoof emails, get a specific type of malware. What you're doing with cyber intrusions a lot of times is you're using a 0-day, which is basically like a cyber weapon, because the term 0-day comes from it's a vulnerability that has not been patched. And so the moment that it's seen in the wild, the defenders have 0 days basically to catch up and try and patch it. And so a cyber weapon gets less useful over time, because if you use it first, it's kind of like a golden gun. You get one shot and your enemy doesn't see it coming. But then as soon as it's used, somebody there is probably already reporting it to Microsoft, Apple, whoever, to patch that. And so, a 2-day vulnerability can still be useful, but it's less useful than a 0-day. And so states are now collecting a lot of these 0 days, the US included, to basically carry out these operations. And so that's, how a lot of these operations come about. But in this particular case, it was good old fashioned spear phishing to the DNC that the Russians used to get in. And then once they found, all of this treasure trove of data and kind of scraped all of the emails that the DNC had been sending back and forth, which, some of them included strategizing about, was Hillary preferred or was Bernie preferred? And so, it aired a lot of, I think, dirty laundry, which no political party is going to enjoy. But it kind of put Democrats on the defensive at a time when they probably were trying to build momentum. And then also as a result, there was a lot of politicization around it, because it was already a politically fraught, very partisan election, between Democrats and Republicans. And so it was basically just this kind of scenario of Russia affecting that in a very clear way. And then how they released the information was, I think a lot of people's first real exposure to disinformation, and the term disinformation or misinformation has been around for a while, but it's really only come into common parlance like recently. And it's because of things like this. They leak some truth and some of the emails that are real, and then they'll sprinkle in false bits that talk about, it's kind of where a lot of the QAnon stuff started, because they're just like, oh yeah, Hillary Clinton is a pedophile and operates out of this like pizza joint. It's like,
it actually goes to show, even how I was describing it, it goes to show how it starts from like a misinformation on a top level, and then it goes all the way down to the people who just can't get enough of this stuff. So even where I don't think that it's abnormal for a political party to be having a discussion for which candidate do we think is going to win this for us, which do we think that we should support, and which should we put all of our power behind. But even the way that I process it through the all the channels that I usually consume, probably more like left leaning channels, but even I was like, oh yeah, there was a conspiracy, and meanwhile, it was just kind of business as usual. And I'm only kind of like realizing that now, but the vernacular of how it's described gets into your consciousness, and that's the way you understand things. So yes, it's really interesting that. And so for, I guess, final attribution that say this is Russia, I guess it's as close to like science. Like there's rarely any laws like gravity, for example. It's mostly theories that you can point as much evidence to as possible to say this is correct. So it sounds like there's no smoking gun per se that you found a computer in China or whatnot, but in Russia, but it's saying like, listen, we have more than enough evidence for how they are using these spear phishing attacks and who might benefit from this, that it is, with a very high likelihood of, close to 100% that this was Russia. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah. So, how cyber forensic works is a lot how regular forensics works, right? So what you kind of see in even from your, Hollywood or Law and Order shows is like when a crime scene is there, it's kind of like you leave the crime scene intact, you take a bunch of photos, and then you start looking for particular clues or kind of like, you find if there's a gunshot, you find the bullet and then you find the casing and then you try and match what are the tool marks of like where the hammer comes down on the cartridge and actually like fires it. You can match that, and there's a whole science of matching bullets to a specific gun. And nowadays, that's how you do a lot of murder investigations. Is you're basically able to trace that back to the point of origin and say, without a doubt, it's this gun. And it holds up in court because they figured out a very good scientific method for that. And cyber is a little bit trickier because you can spoof a lot of these things. You can fake it. You can fake where you're coming from with a VPN. You can use several different VPN hot points. You can, use malware that's made in a different country type of a thing. Right. But more often than not, what we rely on is again, the same sort of science. Is just like somebody somewhere always makes a mistake. It's very hard nowadays to like completely scrub, your own kind of fingerprints from things. And malware has tool marks just like bullets do. So you can kind of tell about where the malware came from, what language it was encoded in. If you dig back far enough, and then we still rely on what we call like operational security mistakes, which are just like kind of being sloppy, So some of the earlier stuff can just be like, yeah, they used an email that's not necessarily connected to them, but you'll still see actors, make dumb mistakes because they're human, just like the rest of us. Like they'll while they're on an operation, maybe they'll go check, their wife asked them to like pick up something at the store, and they'll like Google something while on, like a VPN network or something like that, and just kind of not realize that that is being recorded somewhere. And you figure out like, okay, well, they're looking up stuff in this city, so maybe they're located in this city, and that gives you a clue to start, where to look. So
wow,
there's a whole bunch of different ways that you get to that point, and it's never 100% unless you're like literally they're pressing enter and you like kick down the doors right at that moment, freeze. So it's never 100%, but you can get, into a pretty high percentage where you say a lot of times, like you're just looking at a piece of malware saying like, okay, for China, like this was originally encoded in Chinese. They had to convert to this language processor for that to make sense on Western systems. There's a couple command and control servers that they forgot to use a VPN on, and it points back to somewhere in China. And then you can
I didn't think that you could even do something like track the language in the software, because that's such a huge indicator, because it's such a large lift, I would imagine, for like, let's say a Chinese operative to, unless you have like a Russian that grew up in China and they speak both languages, like that would be difficult to code entire operations in a different language, or is it easier than I think?
It's pretty hard. I mean, it's I would say it's like akin to like being able to do medical stuff in a couple different languages. It's like you're not just doing the normal "hi, how are you" type of words, but like you have to learn special medical terminology to like be a doctor in multiple languages. So I think that coding is very much in that same ballpark of kind of like most people are comfortable coding in a very specific language. It's pretty hard for people to kind of switch back and forth. So, there's a lot of tool marks like that if you get good technical guys that can reverse engineer the malware, like they can pull all those things apart and tell you like, they use a really interesting code string here, and I've actually only seen this somewhere else on the internet, and find it.
Right.
So.
Well, it would be like how you said